The courthouse doors had barely swung shut behind us when my former mother-in-law stepped directly into my path. She planted the tip of her cane on the concrete outside the Hamilton County Courthouse in Noblesville, Indiana, and looked at me with the same expression she'd worn for years whenever she wanted me to feel small. "Don't ever set foot in my house again," Lorraine snapped loudly enough for people walking by to hear. "Get out!" My ex-husband, Mark, stood a few feet behind her in his tailored navy suit. He folded his arms across his chest and smirked, as if the divorce judge had just handed him the greatest victory of his life. I adjusted the strap of my worn leather purse and took a slow breath. The migraine that had been building behind my right eye since dawn pulsed again. Then I smiled. "Actually, Lorraine," I said quietly, "the sale closed this morning." She frowned. "What sale?" "I sold the house." Her face barely changed before I added one more sentence, "and your son isn't the CEO anymore." For 2 full seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mark laughed, not a nervous laugh, a loud, confident one that turned a few heads on the courthouse steps. "Diane," he said, shaking his head, "you've always had quite an imagination." Lorraine laughed too. "You really think anyone believes that?" I didn't answer. There was nothing left to explain. Not yet. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a small envelope, and handed it to Lorraine. "These are the instructions from the attorney. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings." She didn't even take the envelope. Mark stepped forward. "You've officially lost your mind." Maybe he believed that. Or maybe he needed to. Because if he admitted even for a second that I wasn't bluffing, everything he'd believed about the last 25 years would come crashing down. 6 months earlier, I never imagined I'd be standing outside a courthouse saying those words. Back then, I was still trying to save a marriage that had quietly disappeared years before I realized it. That people always ask when a marriage ends. In my experience, it isn't one big moment, it's hundreds of little ones. It was Mark stopping by my office only when he needed a signature. It was eating dinner alone 3 nights a week, because another client meeting ran late. It was him introducing himself at company events without ever mentioning me. The worst one happened at the Indiana Manufacturing Leadership Awards in downtown Indianapolis. Our company, Carter Precision Systems, had just received an award for 25 years in business. I sat at table 12, wearing a dark green dress I'd owned for nearly 10 years. Nothing fancy. I was never much for expensive clothes. Mark walked onto the stage. He looked confident, comfortable, like he'd rehearsed every word. "I started Carter Precision Systems with nothing more than a dream," he told the audience. People applauded. "I worked every day to build this company into what it is today." More applause. I waited. Surely he'd mention the people who actually kept the company alive. Our employees, his late father, maybe me instead. "Thank you all for believing in my vision." That was it. I smiled politely because everyone else was smiling. Inside, something hurt. Not because I needed applause, but because I'd spent 25 years making sure payroll went out every Friday. I'd refinanced our home during the recession. When cash flow nearly collapsed in 2009, I called suppliers myself and begged for another 30 days. I remembered sitting in our tiny office with stacks of unpaid invoices while my father quietly slid an envelope across the desk. He'd sold part of his farmland near Lafayette, $320. Susan. Everything he'd saved after my mother died. He looked at me and simply said, "If you believe this company can survive, then so do I." That money didn't buy us luxury, it bought us time. Time became survival. Survival became growth. Growth became the company Mark now called his alone. A week after the awards banquet, I noticed something else. Mark stopped wearing his wedding ring. Not always, only when he traveled. I said nothing. By then, silence had become easier than arguments. Then one Tuesday evening, he came home carrying a folder. I was heating leftover chicken soup because my migraine had been bothering me all afternoon. He laid the folder beside my bowl. "I've already signed." I looked down. Divorce papers, no conversation, just signatures waiting for mine. "I think this is best," he said. I kept staring at the papers. "What happened to us?" He sighed impatiently. "Diane, we've been roommates for years." I nodded slowly. Maybe that part was true. But roommates don't erase each other. He leaned against the kitchen counter. "I've talked with my attorney. Of course he had. I'll make sure you're comfortable financially. Comfortable. After 25 years, I finally looked at him. What do you think I contributed to this company? He actually looked surprised by the question. You handled spreadsheets. Just 4 words. You handled spreadsheets. Nothing about negotiating loans. Nothing about keeping employees insured. Nothing about sitting beside hospital beds after workplace injuries. Nothing about missing vacations because someone had to stay behind. Just you handled spreadsheets. He picked up his keys. I have dinner with Natalie, I assumed. Though he didn't say her name. After the front door closed, I sat there alone until the soup turned cold. I wasn't crying. Not yet. I was trying to understand how someone could live beside me for 25 years and genuinely believe I'd simply organized paperwork. 2 days later, I met Rachel Kim. She'd served on our board for years and had become one of the few people I trusted completely. We met at a quiet coffee shop near Meridian Street in Indianapolis. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee once. What do you want? I expected legal advice. Instead, she asked that. I don't know. Yes, you do. I looked out the window. I want him to stop pretending I never existed. Rachel nodded. Then she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Did you sign this year's voting proclamation? I blinked. No, you haven't. I forgot. Rachel smiled for the first time all morning. No. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick corporate binder. You remembered exactly when you needed to. She opened it carefully before sliding it across the table. Turn to page 32. I frowned. What am I looking for? Rachel folded her hands. The reason Mark may have made the biggest mistake of his career. I stared at page 32 for several seconds before I looked back up at Rachel. The page wasn't dramatic. No bold headlines, no secret clause highlighted in yellow. Just a chart, boxes, names, numbers, corporate language I'd spent half my life reading. I don't understand, I admitted. Rachel turned the binder toward herself and tapped the page with one finger. You own 38% of the company's equity. I know, but that's not what matters here, she pointed lower. Your Class A preferred shares carry 5 votes each. I nodded slowly. I remember Dad insisting on that, so do I. Rachel leaned back. Mark remembers too. That surprised me. I thought you were about to tell me he'd forgotten. She shook her head. No, that would make this story too easy. She smiled faintly. Mark didn't forget. He got comfortable. That sentence stayed with me. For years, every annual shareholders meeting followed the same routine. A few weeks beforehand, Mark's assistant would email me a proxy authorization. I'd sign it. Mark voted my shares. The meeting ended. Life went on. I trusted him, I said quietly. Rachel nodded, and he came to believe trust was permanent. She slid another document across the table. This year's proxy, it was blank, unsigned. I never sent it back. No. Rachel looked directly at me. For the first time in 17 years, Mark doesn't control your votes. I sat there without speaking. Outside, a delivery truck backed into the alley behind the coffee shop. Someone laughed near the counter. Life kept moving. Mine had suddenly changed. Rachel continued gently. When your father invested in Carter Precision Systems 15 years ago, he didn't write Mark a check. He invested in me. Exactly. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Dad had never disliked Mark. He simply believed business and marriage were two different things. If this company ever survives because of my money, he'd said back then, I want everyone to remember where that money came from. Rachel had been the young attorney who drafted the agreement. Each Class A share carried 5 votes. They couldn't be converted without my written consent. They couldn't be diluted without my approval. Back then, none of us imagined the company would someday be worth more than $100 million. We were just trying to make payroll. So, what happens now? I asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands. That depends on why you're asking. What do you mean? If you're trying to punish your husband for having an affair, she let the sentence hang. Then don't do this. I blinked. I wouldn't, I know. She looked relieved. But if you're trying to protect a company whose leadership has stopped acting in its employees' best interests, she closed the binder. That's a different conversation. Over the next few weeks, divorce mediation moved forward. Everything became paperwork. Financial statements, property valuations, retirement accounts, insurance policies. 25 years of marriage reduced to folders with colored tabs. Mark was polite whenever lawyers were present, almost cheerful. It was strange. He treated the divorce like a business transaction he'd already won. During one mediation session, our attorneys reviewed the marital property. The old Carmel house came up. It had belonged to my parents before they passed away. Although it had become part of the marital estate for settlement purposes, it also needed expensive repairs. The roof was nearing the end of its life. The original windows leaked every winter. The plumbing wasn't exactly young either. Mark barely looked at the appraisal. "I don't want it." His attorney glanced at him. "You sure? I have no interest in maintaining that place." He turned toward me. "You always liked old houses." I said nothing. He wanted something else instead, the downtown Indianapolis condo, most of our brokerage account, his boat, several investment accounts. His lawyer quietly rearranged the numbers. By the end of the afternoon, Mark had formally agreed to waive any future claim to the Carmel house as part of the settlement package. He looked pleased with himself. Walking out to the parking lot, I heard him tell his attorney, "I got the better deal." Maybe he believed that. At home, Lorraine had already started acting like I no longer lived there. One Thursday afternoon, I came back from a doctor's appointment. The arthritis in 2 fingers of my right hand had been bothering me again. When I stepped inside, cardboard boxes filled the front hallway. One box had a thick black marker label, **donate**. I knelt carefully and opened it. On top sat my parents' wedding photograph, beneath it, Dad's old pocket knife, my mother's handwritten recipe cards, an album filled with photographs from the first years of Carter Precision Systems, our first rented garage, Mark covered in machine grease, me holding Emily with one arm, while answering payroll calls with the other. One photograph had been bent across the corner. I gently flattened it. Lorraine walked in carrying grocery bags. "Oh," she didn't sound embarrassed. "I figured Mark wouldn't want all that old clutter." I looked up. "My parents are clutter." She sighed dramatically. "Don't start. I'm asking. You'll be moving soon anyway." She set the groceries on the counter. "There's no reason to drag useless memories around forever." I carefully closed the album. Those weren't memories to me. They were proof. Proof that I had been there from the beginning. That evening, while carrying laundry upstairs, I heard Lorraine talking on the phone. She didn't know I was home. I told Natalie she'd love this kitchen once they remodel it. A pause. "Oh, absolutely." She laughed. "The cabinets are ancient." Another pause. "We'll finally make this house look modern." I quietly walked back downstairs before she noticed me. Not because I was afraid, because I suddenly realized she wasn't imagining a future where I still existed. The following Monday, my phone rang. Tom Alvarez, our outside CPA. He almost never called me directly. "Diane." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Do you have a few minutes?" "I do. I've been reviewing executive compensation." Something about his tone made me sit down. "I found several things Rachel needs to see." "What kind of things?" He lowered his voice. "Large executive retention bonuses. That's not unusual. These were approved without full board review." I frowned. "Anything else?" "A resort trip listed as a vendor conference." Silence. "One hotel room." I didn't need him to say another name. He continued. "There's more." He explained that retirement contributions for hourly employees had quietly been reduced while executive bonuses increased. Several accounting classifications didn't make sense. Nothing screamed criminal. But together, the picture wasn't good. 3. When I hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for almost 20 minutes. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about Frank Doyle. He'd worked for us since the garage days. 68 years old now, still showing up every morning before sunrise. If Mark really had chosen bonuses over people like Frank, this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. That evening, Emily came over. She stood in my kitchen, twisting her coffee mug between both hands. "Mom." I looked at her. I knew. I froze. "Knew what about Natalie?" The words barely came out for almost a year. The room suddenly felt very quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily started crying. "Dad said you already knew." "I didn't. He said your marriage had been over for years." I looked down at the table. I believed him. She wiped her face. I thought staying neutral meant I wasn't choosing sides. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Sometimes silence chooses for you." I didn't say it out loud. She already knew. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. Rachel. Tom finished reviewing everything. I held my breath. We have enough. For what? She answered calmly. An emergency board meeting. When tomorrow? She paused just long enough for my stomach to tighten. 10. I barely slept the night before the board meeting. Not because I was afraid of Mark. I was afraid of myself. At 49, you stopped believing every difficult decision has a clean ending. I'd spent 25 years helping build Carter Precision Systems. I knew every hallway, every machine, every employee birthday, and every family emergency we'd quietly helped through. What if removing Mark hurt the people I was trying to protect? That question stayed with me until sunrise. I stood in my kitchen with a mug of coffee I never drank. The migraine from the day before had faded, but my stomach felt tight. Around 7:30, my phone buzzed. Rachel, I know what you're thinking, she said before I spoke. Do you? You're wondering whether this is becoming personal. I looked out the window at the maple tree my father had planted, the year Emily was born. It is personal, it is. Rachel didn't argue, but that doesn't make it wrong. I stayed quiet, she continued. If Tom's report were clean, I'd tell you to walk away. And if it isn't, then your responsibility isn't to Mark. She paused. It's to the company. An hour later, I drove to the office. The familiar Carter Precision Systems sign came into view, and for a moment, I remembered the first building we'd rented. 8,000 square feet, one loading dock, one coffee maker that barely worked. Back then, Mark and I celebrated every new customer with takeout pizza. We weren't competing with each other. We were surviving together. That memory almost made me turn the car around. Almost. When I entered the lobby, I noticed people behaving normally. Someone laughed near the vending machines. Forklift alarms echoed faintly from the production floor. Reception answered phones. Nobody knew what was about to happen upstairs. I hoped they never would. Not the details. Companies survive bad leadership. They don't survive constant public drama. I took the elevator to the executive floor. Rachel and Tom were already there. Tom looked exhausted. I reviewed everything twice, he said quietly. You won't find mistakes. I never thought you would. He nodded. I wish I had. Rachel handed me a folder. This isn't your fight unless you decide it is. I appreciated that. Nobody was pushing me. Nobody was promising revenge. Only accountability. At 9:10, another board member arrived. Stephen Cole. He'd served on the board nearly as long as Rachel. He greeted me politely. I wasn't expecting to see you today. I imagine Mark wasn't either. He smiled faintly. I'll be honest, I hope you are. I'm uncomfortable mixing divorce and corporate governance. So am I. That seemed to surprise him. I don't want revenge, Stephen. Then why are we here? I looked him straight in the eyes, because if Tom's report had been about anyone else, we'd still be having this meeting. He considered that for a few seconds, then simply nodded. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. At 9:40, my attorney called. The judge signed the settlement. I closed my eyes. So, it's official. Yes, and the property? The title company has authorization to close. I whispered. Thank you. The call ended. I stared at my phone for a long moment. The Carmel house was finally mine alone. Not because I'd tricked anyone, because Mark had chosen something else. During mediation, he'd insisted on keeping the downtown condominium, most of our brokerage account, and his boat. He'd called my parents' old house a money pit. He wanted liquidity. He wanted convenience. He'd laughed when his own attorney suggested thinking twice. She can have the old place. Those had been his exact words. Now, the closing attorney was waiting only for final confirmation from Ben Foster. For the first time in months, I allowed myself one slow breath. At 9:55, my phone buzzed again. An email. Subject *** shareholder proxy authorization ***. I frowned. The sender was Mark's executive assistant. Routine, professional, exactly the same format I'd received every year. Please sign at your earliest convenience. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because habit is powerful. For 17 years I would have opened the attachment, signed it without reading, and sent it back. My hand actually reached for the mouse. Then I stopped the date. Today's date, 10, board meeting. I immediately forwarded the email to Rachel. A few seconds later, she replied, ***. Thank you. Do not respond. That one email told the board something important. Mark wasn't trying to steal my vote. He simply assumed he'd always have it. Sometimes arrogance doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it quietly expects yesterday to repeat forever. At exactly 10, Mark walked into the boardroom. Same confident smile, same expensive suit, coffee in one hand. He looked around the room. "Morning, everyone." Nobody answered immediately. He noticed me. His smile faded. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited." He laughed once. "This is a board meeting." Rachel closed the leather folder in front of her. "It is. So why is Diane sitting here?" Rachel answered calmly. "Because she's a director and a voting shareholder." Mark blinked. "Fine," he shrugged. "Let's get this over with." He sat at the opposite end of the table. Natalie wasn't inside. She waited outside, probably expecting Mark to introduce her later as our next chief operating officer. Rachel looked around the room. "Before we begin, I'd like everyone to confirm they've received Tom Alvarez's audit summary." Papers rustled. Everyone nodded. Mark looked irritated. "What audit?" Tom slid a folder toward him. "You'll want to read page 4. Mark flipped through the first few pages. His expression changed. "What is this?" Rachel answered, "Our agenda." He looked back down. Executive compensation, conflict of interest, travel reimbursement, unauthorized bonus approvals. The room grew quiet. Even the air conditioner suddenly sounded louder. Mark looked directly at me. "This is because of the divorce." "No, it's exactly because of the divorce." Rachel interrupted gently. "No," she folded her hands. "This meeting is about corporate governance." Mark leaned back. "You've got to be kidding." Rachel remained calm. "The evidence speaks for itself." Tom cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter." Mark glared at him. "To Portis's, the accounting records show executive retention bonuses approved without full board authorization. They were legal, perhaps." Tom nodded. "But they weren't properly disclosed." Mark looked toward me again. "You planned this." I met his eyes. "I planned to tell the truth." His voice hardened. "You're willing to destroy the company because I left you for a moment." The room disappeared. I saw us 25 years earlier, covered in machine grease, eating cold pizza on folding chairs, laughing because we'd finally landed our first big contract. Then I came back to the present. "No." I spoke quietly. "I'm trying to stop you from destroying the company we built, not the company you built." "The company we built?" Nobody spoke. Rachel looked around the table. "The board will now review the motion concerning executive leadership." She placed one final document in front of every director. Then she looked at me. I suddenly realized this wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of whatever came next. Nobody reached for a pen. Not right away. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than any argument I'd ever heard. Mark looked from one face to another, searching for someone who would smile, crack a joke, or tell him this was all some misunderstanding. Nobody did. Rachel adjusted her reading glasses. "Mr. Carter, before the board considers any motion, you're entitled to respond to the findings." Mark straightened in his chair gladly. He slid Tom's report aside as though it were nothing more than a restaurant menu. "The relationship between Natalie and me is personal." He glanced at me before continuing. "My marriage had already broken down." Rachel nodded once. "The board isn't evaluating your marriage. Then why bring it up?" "Because the relationship wasn't disclosed while executive compensation decisions affecting Miss Green were being made." Mark folded his arms. "She earned every dollar." Tom opened another folder. "No one is questioning her work performance." He pushed several documents toward the directors. "We're questioning the approval process." Mark looked at the papers but didn't touch them. Tom continued calmly. 3 retention bonuses were approved without full board review." He turned another page. "The Aspen resort trip was categorized as vendor development." Another page. "The receipts show no scheduled vendor meetings." Another. "The hotel reservation lists 1 suite." Mark's jaw tightened. "You've been digging through my private life," Rachel answered before Tom could. "No, we've been reviewing company records." That distinction mattered. This wasn't about catching a cheating husband. It was about whether the company's leadership had stopped respecting the rules everyone else followed. Mark leaned forward. "This company doubled in value under my leadership." Rachel nodded. "It also belongs to its shareholders, and to 180 employees," I added quietly. He turned toward me. So now you're pretending this is about them. No, I've spent 25 years worrying about them. The words came easier than I expected. I remember calling machinists during the recession to promise payroll would still clear on Friday. I remember sitting with Frank Doyle's wife in the hospital. I remember telling employees we'd find a way through CO before we even knew how. I looked around the room. I don't remember asking for credit. Mark laughed once. Bull. I shook my head. I asked for honesty. The room fell silent again. Rachel placed a printed resolution in front of every director. The first motion concerns Miss Natalie Green. The vote was quick. Her pending promotion to Chief Operating Officer was withdrawn. Administrative leave. Independent review. The motion carried unanimously. Mark looked stunned. He'd expected disagreement. He'd found unity, Rachel continued. The second motion concerns Mr. Carter's position as Chief Executive Officer. She paused long enough for every director to look down at the resolution. The recommendation before the board is removal as CEO, effective immediately, and appointment of David Reynolds as Interim Chief Executive Officer, pending a permanent search. Mark stood up so quickly, his chair rolled backward. This is insane. Nobody answered. He looked directly at Stephen Cole. You've known me 20 years. Stephen sighed. I have, so vote no. Stephen looked genuinely uncomfortable. I wish this weren't happening, so do I, but I can't ignore the governance issues. Mark stared at him, then at another director, then another. Finally, he looked at me. Rachel spoke firmly. No, Mark, this is the board's decision. She looked around the table. Please cast your votes. One by one, hands went up. Yes, yes, yes. Stephen hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might save Mark. Instead, he slowly raised his hand. Rachel counted quietly. The motion passes. She looked at Mark. Effective immediately, you're removed as Chief Executive Officer of Carter Precision Systems. No applause, no dramatic music, just silence. Mark remained standing. His face had gone pale. You can't do this. Rachel folded the signed resolution. We already did. She slid the document toward me. As chair, I need one additional signature acknowledging the shareholder certification. My fingers ached as I picked up the pen. The arthritis in my right hand chose that exact moment to remind me it existed. I almost smiled. Life had a strange sense of timing. I signed, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted the record to be accurate. Mark stared at the signature, 25 years reduced to one line of ink. A facilities manager knocked softly on the open door. He'd worked with us for nearly 15 years. His voice was almost apologetic. Mr. Carter, whenever you're ready, I'll help you collect your personal belongings. Not security officers. Not humiliation, just a man doing his job. That somehow made it even sadder. Not an hour later, I walked out of the building alone. The summer air felt warmer than I'd expected. Instead of relief, I felt tired. Deeply tired. My phone rang. It was my attorney. Diane, everything all right? The closing is complete. I closed my eyes. So, it's official. Yes, Ben Foster now owns the Carmel property. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat inside my car for several minutes without starting the engine. I'd imagined this moment dozens of times. I thought I'd feel victorious. Instead, I missed my father. I wished he could have seen that the little house he'd loved so much would remain standing instead of being torn down. Ben had promised to restore it, not replace it. Dad would have liked that. I drove to Carmel, because there was one last box of personal things I'd left behind. When I pulled onto the street, another SUV was already parked outside. Ben Foster stood talking with his realtor. They smiled politely when they saw me. Then another car stopped. Mark. He climbed out without saying a word. A minute later, Lorraine opened the front door. She spotted me immediately. Her face hardened. She walked toward the front steps as quickly as her knees allowed. Then she planted her cane across the walkway. Don't ever set foot in my house again. Several neighbors glanced over. Lorraine didn't care. Get out. I took one slow breath. Actually, Lorraine. She folded her arms. Yet the sale closed this morning. What? I sold the house. She laughed. No, you didn't. And Mark isn't the CEO anymore. She looked toward her son. Mark didn't answer. For the first time since I'd known him, he couldn't find any words. Ben quietly stepped forward. Mrs. Me Carter. Lorraine frowned. He held out a folder. I'm the new owner. She ignored the folder. This is my son's house. Ben didn't argue. He simply opened the paperwork to the final page, Mark's signature, the settlement agreement, the closing confirmation. Lorraine grabbed the papers. Her eyes moved from one page to another. Then she looked at Mark. "You signed this?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't think." "No," she interrupted him. "You didn't." Her voice cracked. For a second she looked much older than 74. At that moment a sheriff's deputy pulled up. One of the neighbors had called, after hearing the shouting. The deputy listened patiently, reviewed the paperwork, then handed everything back. "Ma'am," he said gently, "the property legally changed ownership this morning." He wasn't rude. He wasn't dramatic. He simply explained that the court-approved agreement gave Lorraine 72 hours to remove her belongings. Nothing more, nothing less. Ben turned toward her. "I've already arranged movers if you need help." Lorraine didn't answer. She was still staring at Mark. I suddenly noticed 3 paint samples tucked under her arm. White, gray, cream. She had been planning a new kitchen. Ben smiled politely. "For what it's worth." He pointed toward the old cabinets. "I actually plan to restore those for the first time all afternoon." I almost laughed. Not at Lorraine, at life. She'd spent months planning to remodel a house that was never going to be hers. I picked up my last cardboard box from the hallway. As I walked toward my car, Mark followed me. "Diane." I stopped. "Please." His voice sounded different, now not angry. "Desperate, I need you to fix this. This the board. You still have influence." I looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want your marriage back." "I know, I want my job." I believed him. That hurt more than I expected. He still didn't understand what he'd actually lost. "I can't help you." "You could?" I shook my head. "No." He lowered his voice. "I'm asking. So am I. For what? Respect." He looked away. I climbed into my car. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived in my mailbox. ***, Carter Precision Systems Annual Employee Appreciation Banquet. I almost dozed through it away until I noticed one handwritten note at the bottom. "Please come. Rachel. ***. When I walked into the ballroom at the Indiana State Museum that evening, the first person I saw was Mark. He wasn't supposed to be there. I stopped just inside the ballroom doors. The Indiana State Museum had hosted Carter Precision Systems' annual Employee Appreciation Dinner for years. But this time, the room felt different. Rounds, covered with white linen, stretched across the ballroom. People who had worked beside me for decades stood talking over coffee and slices of pecan pie. Some had retired years ago, but still came every summer, because in many ways the company had been their second family. Then I saw Mark. He was standing alone near the back wall in a charcoal suit. Not at the head table, not surrounded by executives, just standing there. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. I wasn't interested in another confrontation. Rachel spotted me before I could escape. She walked over, smiling warmly. "I'm glad you came." I almost didn't, I figured. She glanced toward Mark. "He insisted on attending. You let him? He's still a shareholder." She lowered her voice. "But tonight isn't about him." I nodded. "I hope not." Rachel touched my arm gently. "I have one favor to ask." "What is it?" "Just stay until the end. I don't know if I can." "You can." Her confidence reminded me of something my father used to say whenever I doubted myself. You don't have to enjoy doing the hard thing. You just have to do it. Dinner passed quietly. People stopped by my table to say hello. Most asked how I was doing. A few apologized for not reaching out during the divorce. I told them the truth. I wasn't ready to talk. Frank Doyle eventually sat down beside me. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. His hair had turned almost completely white, and he moved more slowly than he used to. But his smile hadn't changed. "Good to see you, kid." He'd been calling me kid since I was 24. "I've missed you, Frank. You look tired." I laughed softly. "I am. You'll sleep better." "I hope so." He nodded toward the stage. "You're going to like tonight." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He only smiled. "You'll see, Anna." After dessert, Rachel stepped onto the stage. The conversations gradually faded. She thanked everyone for another successful year before talking briefly about the company's history. This year marks 25 years since Carter Precision Systems opened its first workshop. A large screen behind her lit up. An old photograph appeared, the garage. I hadn't seen that picture in years. There was Mark, 28 years old, grinning beside our first used milling machine. Then another picture. Me sitting on a folding chair with a calculator. Invoices spread across a card table. The next one made me laugh through unexpected tears. Emily as a toddler asleep in a cardboard box while I finished payroll. People around the room chuckled. Another picture. Dad standing proudly beside the first CNC machine we'd managed to buy with his investment. I felt my throat tighten. Rachel continued speaking. For many years, our company history recognized only one founder. She paused. That history was incomplete. The next slide appeared. A simple title, asterisk, asterisk, founders, asterisk, 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 Mark Carter, asterisk, 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 Diane Whitmore Carter, asterisk, asterisk. The room became very quiet. Rachel looked directly at me. Some people build companies by making sales. She looked around the ballroom. Others build companies by making sure every employee gets paid. Every supplier gets called. Every problem gets solved before anyone else notices. She smiled. Tonight we're correcting the record. I heard my chair scrape softly against the floor as someone stood. Then another, then another. I turned. Frank Doyle was already on his feet. He wasn't clapping yet. He simply stood. Within seconds, nearly everyone else followed. The applause started slowly, then grew louder and louder. I looked around the room. People I'd hired, people I'd comforted after surgeries, people whose children I'd watched grow up. Some were smiling, some were crying. I was doing both. Rachel motioned toward the stage. I shook my head. No, she smiled. Yes, the applause didn't stop. Eventually, I walked forward. The steps felt strangely long. By the time I reached the microphone, my right hand was trembling enough that I had to hold it with my left. I laughed softly. I had a speech prepared. That wasn't true. The audience laughed with me. I guess I don't anymore. The room grew quiet. I never wanted recognition. I looked across the ballroom. I only wanted the truth. I paused. My father used to tell me that integrity is what you do when nobody is watching. I smiled toward the photograph still displayed behind me. He would have loved seeing all of you together tonight. I took another slow breath. This company was never built by one person. It was built by welders, machinists, receptionists, accountants, engineers, forklift drivers, maintenance crews, and families who believed this place was worth sacrificing for. I looked around one last time. Thank you for letting me be part of that. The applause returned even louder this time. After the program ended, people gathered around to hug me. Frank eventually reached me. You forgot something. What? He smiled. My wife's surgery. I blinked. I didn't forget. You never told anyone. I smiled. It wasn't anyone else's business. Frank turned toward several younger employees standing nearby. When Linda needed heart surgery back in 2007, the insurance hadn't kicked in yet. He looked back at me. Diane arranged an advance out of company funds. I interrupted him. We approved it through payroll. He grinned. She also drove casseroles to our house for 2 weeks. I felt my face turn warm. You don't have to tell everyone that. Yes. He nodded firmly. I do. He looked around the room. Mark knew how to grow the business. He pointed gently toward me. She knew how to take care of the people inside it. Nobody applauded that time. They simply nodded. Some truths don't need noise. I noticed Mark standing near the ballroom exit. People weren't avoiding him. They simply weren't gathering around him anymore. He waited until the room had mostly emptied before walking over. We stood facing each other. No lawyers, no judges, no board members, just two people who had once believed they'd grow old together. I owe you an apology. I waited. I should have given you more credit. For a moment, I almost accepted that. Then I realized something. Credit wasn't what had been missing. I looked him in the eye. You should have given me respect. He lowered his head. I know. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he asked quietly, do you think you'll ever forgive me? I thought about that carefully. I already have. He looked surprised. But forgiveness isn't permission to come back, he nodded slowly. I understand. Whether he truly did, I honestly couldn't say. Emily found me outside overlooking the canal. She wrapped her arms around me without saying anything. After a while, she whispered, I'm proud of you. I kissed the top of her head. I'm proud of you too. She smiled. For what? For finally realizing you don't have to carry everyone else's arguments. She laughed. I'm still learning. So am I. Life became surprisingly ordinary after that. I bought a small ranch-style home in Zanesville. No stairs. A little garden. Enough room for Emily whenever she visited. And I started consulting for smaller manufacturing companies a few days each month. Just enough to stay busy, not enough to lose my weekends again. Ben Foster occasionally sent photos as he restored my parents' old house. He kept the original hardwood floors, the front porch, even the kitchen cabinets Lorraine had wanted to replace. Dad would have smiled. 3 months later, a handwritten envelope arrived. The return address surprised me. Lorraine inside was a single sheet of paper. Asterisk Diane asterisk. Asterisk, I was wrong about the house. I was wrong about your place in the company. Asterisk. I don't expect you to answer. Asterisk, I only wanted you to know. Asterisk Lorraine asterisk. I didn't write back immediately. A few weeks later, I mailed her a simple card wishing her well after another round of physical therapy. Compassion didn't erase the past. It simply meant I no longer wanted to carry bitterness into whatever years I had left. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether winning felt as satisfying as I'd imagined. The truth? Not exactly. Watching Mark lose his title didn't heal me. Selling the house didn't heal me. Being recognized at the banquet didn't heal me. What healed me was finally believing I didn't have to earn respect from people who had already decided not to give it. Growing older teaches you something success never can. Peace is worth protecting. Your dignity is worth protecting, and it's never too late to stop apologizing for knowing your own value. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone underestimated you, I hope you know you're not alone. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I truly hope the people in your life recognize your worth before it's too late. My husband Ethan had just driven out of sight when my 7-year-old daughter leaned close and whispered, "Mom, run right now." I stared at her. "What, Lily? What's wrong?" She was trembling so hard her teeth nearly clicked. "Don't ask. We have to get out of the house now." The terror in her eyes kept me from arguing. I grabbed my purse, took her hand, and rushed toward the front door. That was when it happened. The first sound was not an explosion. It was a deep, metallic groan beneath the kitchen floor, low and unnatural, like the house itself had taken a breath. Then the windows burst. The force threw me sideways before I could reach the porch. My shoulder struck the entryway wall. Lily's hand slipped from mine, and the air filled with heat, glass, and a violent roar that seemed to swallow every other sound. For one suspended second, I could not see her. I could not hear her. All I could think was that I had let go. "Lily." My voice came out broken. Smoke rolled through the hallway, gray and thick, and somewhere behind me, wood cracked with the sharp pop of gunfire. I dropped to my knees, crawling over shattered picture frames and splintered trim, calling her name until my lungs burned. Then I heard a tiny cough from the porch. She had made it through the doorway. She was curled against the brick column outside, one hand pressed over her ear, blood running in a thin line down her shin. I lunged toward her, pulled her against my chest, and half carried, half dragged her across the front lawn. Behind us, flames pushed through the kitchen windows. Our neighbor, Mr. Halpern, was already running from his garage in socks and a Cardinals sweatshirt. "Get away from the house," he shouted. The gas line could go again. I scooped Lily up and kept moving until we reached the sidewalk across the street. My knees gave out there. I sat hard on the curb, clutching her while alarms began sounding from every direction. First smoke detectors, then car horns, then the rising wail of fire engines. Lily buried her face in my neck. "You listened?" she whispered. I looked down at her. Of course I listened, but I did not understand what she meant. 10 minutes earlier, our morning had been ordinary. Ethan had stood at the kitchen island in a pressed blue shirt, scrolling through emails while I packed Lily's lunch. He was supposedly driving to Indianapolis International Airport for a 3-day business trip to Chicago, where his software company had meetings with potential investors. He complained that the coffee was weak, kissed Lily on the top of her head, and reminded me that the garage door had been sticking again. "Call someone before it freezes up completely," he said. I had laughed. "You mean call someone before you get back and have to deal with it?" He gave me that familiar crooked smile. Exactly. Nothing about him had seemed frightened. Nothing had seemed final. He kissed my cheek at the door, picked up his leather carry-on and said, "I'll text when I land." Then his SUV rolled down Hawthorne Ridge Drive and disappeared beyond the curve. The moment it was gone, Lily changed. She had been sitting at the breakfast table in unicorn pajamas, pushing blueberries around her plate. Suddenly, she slid out of her chair and hurried toward me. Her face had gone pale. That was when she whispered for me to run. Now, sitting beneath the red flash of emergency lights, I replayed every second. The suitcase, the coffee, the kiss, his calm voice telling me to fix the garage door. A paramedic knelt beside us. Her name tag read Monica. "Ma'am, I need to check both of you." "I'm fine," I said automatically. "You were inside an explosion." That sentence cracked something open in me. I looked back at the house, at the black smoke pouring through the roofline, and finally understood that the place where I had made birthday cakes, folded laundry, and waited for my husband to come home was no longer safe. Monica checked Lily first. A superficial cut on her leg, ringing in one ear, no obvious signs of concussion. I had bruising along my shoulder and several small cuts across my hands. She wanted us transported to the emergency room, but before we left, a fire investigator approached. He introduced himself as Captain Ruiz and spoke carefully, as though every word might frighten me further. "Mrs. Isa Bennett, do you know of any gas problems in the home?" "No." "Any recent repairs to the stove, furnace, or water heater?" "No, nothing." "Did you smell gas this morning?" I shook my head, then looked at Lily. Her whole body stiffened. Captain Ruiz noticed. "Sweetheart, did you smell anything strange?" Lily stared at the pavement. I stroked her hair. "You're not in trouble." She pressed closer to me and whispered, "I don't want Daddy to be mad." A cold sensation moved through my chest, deeper than fear. Why would Daddy be mad? She would not answer. At the hospital, my sister Rachel arrived before Ethan did. She came rushing through the emergency department in yoga pants and a winter coat thrown over a t-shirt, her hair still damp from the shower. She wrapped both of us in her arms and cried against my shoulder. "What happened?" "I don't know." "Where's Ethan? I've called 6 times. His phone went straight to voicemail." That made no sense. He should have been on the interstate, not in the air. I called again and again until a nurse gently asked me to put the phone away so she could clean the glass from my palm. Ethan finally called nearly 40 minutes later. His voice sounded breathless. "Claire, what happened?" "The police called me." The house exploded. There was a pause, too brief to accuse, too long to forget. "Oh my God," he said. "Are you and Lily okay?" "We got out." "How?" I looked across the curtain at Lily sitting on Rachel's lap with a hospital blanket around her shoulders. She told me to run. Another pause. Then Ethan said very quietly, "She did." By the time he reached the hospital, he was crying. He pulled Lily into his arms, kissed her face, and kept saying, "Thank God, thank God." Anyone watching would have seen a terrified husband and father. I saw that too, but I also saw Lily turn her face away from him. Later, when Ethan stepped into the hallway to speak with the fire department, Lily crawled into my bed. She tucked herself under my arm and waited until his footsteps faded. Then she looked up at me, tears filling her eyes. "Mommy," she whispered. "Daddy knew." I didn't answer Lily right away. I simply stared at her. Hospitals have a strange way of making time stand still. Machines beeped somewhere beyond the curtain. Nurses spoke in calm voices that somehow made everything feel more serious. And outside the narrow window, the gray Indiana sky hung low over the parking lot. But inside my head, everything was suddenly moving too fast. Daddy knew. The words refused to leave me alone. "Lily," I whispered carefully, "why would you say that?" Her little fingers twisted the edge of the blanket until her knuckles turned white. I heard him. Before she could say another word, Ethan stepped back into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. His eyes were red, and his shirt was streaked with soot from walking around what remained of our house with the fire investigators. "There are my girls," he said softly. Lily immediately lowered her head. It was subtle. If I hadn't been looking directly at her, I probably wouldn't have noticed. She had always run toward her father. She adored him. He was the one who built backyard forts, taught her how to ride a bike, and spent Saturday mornings making chocolate chip pancakes that were never quite cooked in the middle. Now she wouldn't even look at him. Ethan handed me a cup. "Captain Ruiz said they're treating it as a gas explosion until they know more." I nodded. "They asked whether we'd ever smelled gas." "No, they'll probably have answers in a few days." Again I nodded. He seized my shoulder. We're lucky. Lucky? I looked through the window toward the ambulance bay. If Lily hadn't whispered when she did, neither of us would still be alive. That wasn't luck. That was something else. Rachel insisted we stay with her. You are not getting a hotel, she said as she loaded our overnight bags into her SUV. And you're definitely not trying to rent a place tonight. Her husband, Mark, agreed immediately. The guest room's yours for as long as you need. Their house sat only 15 minutes away in another Carmel neighborhood, close enough that Lily could continue attending her elementary school without changing districts. By evening, the local news had already reported the explosion. Neighbors texted constantly. Church friends offered meals. Parents from Lily's second-grade class asked whether she needed clothes or school supplies. It reminded me why I had always loved living there. People showed up, not because they had to, because that's what neighbors did. Ethan spent most of that first evening on the phone. Insurance, his office, the mortgage company, the restoration contractor. I understood all of those calls. What unsettled me was how organized he seemed. He had already created a spreadsheet listing damaged property. He talked about replacement values, temporary housing reimbursement, coverage limits, personal property claims. He was efficient, too efficient. Rachel noticed it too. Late that night, while Ethan was outside taking another phone call, she quietly asked, "Is it just me, or does he seem strangely focused?" I defended him automatically. Everyone handles trauma differently. I know. She hesitated. I'm just surprised he hasn't stopped crying over almost losing you. I didn't answer because until she said it, I hadn't noticed. As 3 days passed, investigators searched what remained of the house. Insurance adjusters photographed every room. Friends brought casseroles we barely touched. Lily stopped sleeping through the night. She woke crying almost every evening, insisting the lights stay on. A child psychologist explained that this was normal after traumatic events. I wanted desperately to believe that was all it was. But every time I remembered those words, Daddy knew, the knot in my stomach tightened. On the 4th evening, Ethan drove back to the property with the insurance adjuster. Rachel took Mark to one of his physical therapy appointments. For the first time since the explosion, Lily and I were alone. She sat at the kitchen table coloring butterflies. I made us grilled cheese sandwiches. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I sat beside her. Honey. She didn't look up. You said Daddy knew. A tiny nod. What did you mean? Silence. I reached across the table and took her hand. You are safe. Another long silence, then it was my fault. My heart nearly stopped. No. She finally looked at me. I wasn't supposed to hear. Hear what? She swallowed. I was hiding. Hiding where? In the basement. The memory came back to her slowly in broken pieces. The previous Saturday, Ethan had suggested a family game of hide-and-seek. Lily had hidden beneath the basement stairs. It was one of her favorite hiding places. No one ever looked there. She waited quietly. She expected to hear me searching. Instead, she heard the basement door open. Daddy came downstairs. He wasn't alone, not physically. He was talking to someone on speakerphone. Lily couldn't see him. She could only hear. I stayed really still, she whispered. I thought if Daddy found me, I'd lose. She smiled sadly at that innocent thought. Then her face crumpled again. I heard Daddy say. She squeezed her eyes shut. After I leave, I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. What else? Nobody will be inside. She took a shaky breath. It'll look accidental. The room suddenly felt too warm. My hands were ice cold. What else did you hear? I don't know. She started crying. I couldn't hear everything. That's okay. I tried. You don't have to remember. But I do. She covered her face. I remember, he said. The insurance company. Those 3 words landed like stones. Insurance company. My mind immediately rejected the possibility. No, there had to be another explanation. A business discussion. A client. A completely different situation. Because the alternative was impossible. I pulled Lily into my lap. You didn't tell me because you thought Daddy would be angry. She nodded against my shoulder. I wasn't supposed to hear. You did nothing wrong. I thought maybe. She began sobbing. Maybe the house got hurt because I listened. I hugged her tighter. Oh, sweetheart. Children see themselves at the center of everything. When something terrible happens, they often believe they somehow caused it. No, I whispered firmly. This was never your fault. She cried for a long time. I cried with her, not because I believed Ethan had done anything. Not yet, but because somewhere inside me, a tiny crack had appeared. The kind that begins so small you tell yourself it isn't there, until one day the whole foundation gives way. That night, after Lily finally fell asleep, I sat alone on Rachel's back porch. The air smelled of fresh cut grass. Fireflies blinked across the yard. My phone buzzed. It was Captain Ruiz. Mrs. Bennett, he said gently, I wanted to let you know we've completed our preliminary examination. I held my breath. We're no longer treating the explosion as a routine accident. My fingers tightened around the phone. What does that mean? It means, he replied carefully, we found something that requires a much deeper investigation. My entire world shifted. Because for the first time, I realized Lily's frightened whisper might not have been the imagination of a traumatized little girl. It might have been a warning. I barely slept after Captain Ruiz's phone call. Rachel found me sitting at her kitchen table just before sunrise, wrapped in one of her oversized sweatshirts, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. You've been up all night, she said quietly. I nodded. They found something. She sat across from me without asking another question. What kind of something? I don't know yet. That wasn't entirely true. I knew enough to realize the investigation had changed. Enough to understand that Lily's terrified whisper might not have been the frightened imagination of a 7-year-old child. Enough to know I couldn't afford to ignore my instincts anymore. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What are you going to do? I looked out the window. I need facts, not accusations, not theories. Facts. Theory. That afternoon I met with my attorney, Linda Mercer. Linda had handled my parents' estate years earlier, and later helped Rachel through a difficult custody dispute. She was practical, calm, and almost impossible to intimidate. After listening without interrupting, she folded her hands across her desk. Claire, I want you to hear me very carefully. If your husband committed a crime, the police will investigate it, I understand. But if he didn't, accusing him too early could destroy your marriage for nothing. I know. She studied my face. So don't confront him. I frowned. Not yet. Not until you know what you're dealing with. Her advice made sense. Emotion wanted answers. Logic demanded evidence. I'd also like you to meet someone, she continued. A private investigator. She shook her head. A forensic accountant? I blinked. Why? Because if this was financially motivated, money will tell the story long before people do. 2 days later, I sat across from Daniel Reeves. He wasn't what I expected. No expensive suit, no flashy office. Just a quiet man in his early 60s, with reading glasses balanced near the end of his nose, and 30 years of experience tracing financial fraud. He asked only one question before opening his notebook. How involved are you in your family's finances? I smiled awkwardly. I pay household bills. Retirement? Ethan handles it. Investments? Him. Business accounts? I've never seen them. He nodded, as though he had heard the same answer 1,000 times. That's more common than you think. I suddenly felt embarrassed. Not because Ethan managed the finances. Because I had trusted him so completely that I had stopped asking questions years ago. Daniel explained exactly what he intended to review. Tax returns, mortgage records, public filings, business registrations, insurance policies, bank activity that could legally be obtained. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just paperwork. You'd be amazed, he said with a faint smile. How often people hide the truth in plain sight. Life settled into a strange routine. Rachel drove Lily to school every morning. I volunteered in her classroom one afternoon so she wouldn't feel alone. Watching 7-year-olds argue over crayons and spelling words felt oddly comforting. Children continued living, even after explosions. Lily slowly smiled again around her classmates, but every afternoon she checked the windows before sitting down to do homework. Once she quietly asked, "Are we staying here tonight for a while?" She nodded. I like Aunt Rachel's locks. I looked toward the deadbolt on the front door. She had started checking it every evening, sometimes twice. No 7-year-old should know what fear like that feels like. Nah. Ethan was almost never home anymore. Or rather, almost never at Rachel's house. He claimed he was meeting with contractors, insurance representatives, engineers, and his company's investors. His schedule sounded reasonable. Yet, something had changed. He had become strangely impatient. Every conversation somehow drifted back to insurance. The adjuster says replacement costs are higher than expected. The policy should cover temporary housing. I hope they don't delay the claim. One evening over dinner, he even asked, I wonder how long it'll take before the insurance company releases the first payment. Rachel looked at him. So soon? He shrugged. We have to move forward. Move forward. Our home had exploded less than 2 weeks earlier. Our daughter still woke crying almost every night, and Ethan seemed obsessed with paperwork. I told myself grief affected everyone and him. Still, a quiet voice inside me kept asking the same question. Why was he so worried about money? 3 days later, Daniel called. I have enough to meet. His voice sounded unusually serious. We met in a small conference room above his office. He slid several folders across the table. Everything I'm about to show you comes from legitimate public records and financial documents. I nodded. The first document was our mortgage. Or rather, a mortgage I didn't recognize. I don't understand. Daniel adjusted his glasses. Your husband refinanced your house 8 months ago. What? You signed electronically. The sentence died before I finished it. Then I remembered 8 months earlier, Ethan had asked me to sign several online documents while I was making dinner. He had said they were routine banking updates connected to our home equity account. I hadn't even read them. I trusted him. Daniel quietly continued. The refinance increased your debt substantially. My stomach tightened. Why? He withdrew nearly $400,000. What did he do with it? I don't know. He opened another folder. This is more concerning. It was our homeowner's insurance policy. A new policy issued just 5 months before the explosion. Coverage had increased dramatically. Structure, personal property, additional living expenses. Everything. Is this unusual? Not by itself. He pointed toward the effective date, but combined with the refinance, he let the sentence hang. Then came the business records. The Ethan software company had looked successful from the outside. Inside, it was collapsing. Several contracts had been canceled. Revenue had fallen sharply. There were outstanding loans, personal guarantees, investor demands. The company wasn't growing. It was bleeding money. I felt physically sick. So he was in trouble. Daniel nodded slowly. Significant trouble. Could insurance money solve it? It wouldn't solve everything. He paused. But it would buy time. Time. Enough time to avoid bankruptcy. Enough time to satisfy angry investors. Enough time to keep pretending. I stared at the mountain of paperwork. The evidence still didn't prove Ethan had caused the explosion, but it proved something equally important. He had a reason to be desperate. We're free. The next morning, Captain Ruiz called again. His voice was even more careful than before. Mrs. Bennett, I wanted you to hear this from us before rumors begin. I stood alone on Rachel's back porch. What happened? Our forensic team completed its examination. My heartbeat quickened. The explosion was not caused by an old pipe. I closed my eyes. There was no equipment failure. A long silence followed. Finally, I forced myself to ask, then what caused it? We found evidence that someone deliberately loosened a gas connection. The words echoed in my ears. Deliberately, not accidentally. Not naturally. Deliberately. Captain Ruiz continued. From this point forward, this is officially a criminal investigation. After we hung up, I stood outside for several minutes without moving. Rachel eventually opened the back door. Claire. I turned toward her. For the first time since marrying Ethan 12 years earlier, I realized I was no longer trying to prove my husband innocent. I was trying to discover how guilty he really was. But I made one decision before walking back inside. I would tell Ethan nothing. Not about the accountant. Not about the refinance. Not about the insurance policy. Not about the criminal investigation. If he believed I still trusted him, he might make the mistake that finally revealed the truth. Keeping a secret from your own husband is a lonely thing. Keeping one because you no longer know whether your husband tried to destroy your life is something else entirely. For the next week, I became an actress. I smiled when Ethan smiled. I thanked him when he brought takeout home. I sat beside him during meetings with the insurance adjuster and nodded as though I still believed we were simply an unlucky family trying to recover from a terrible accident. Inside, I watched everything. Every word, every expression, every silence. It wasn't easy. For 12 years, I had trusted this man with every part of my life. Now, I found myself wondering why he asked certain questions, why he always wanted updates from the insurance company before asking how Lily had slept, why he checked his phone whenever Captain Rue's name appeared on my screen. The hardest part was pretending none of it bothered me, because if Ethan truly was involved, the one thing I couldn't do was let him know I suspected him. Natto. Lily returned to school full-time. She smiled more often now, though she still insisted on sleeping with the hallway light on whenever we stayed at Rachel's house. One afternoon, while helping her with second-grade math homework, she suddenly asked, "Mom, yes, sweetheart, do grown-ups always tell the truth?" The pencil stopped moving in my hand. I'd like to think they try, but not always. No, she looked down at her workbook. I don't want Daddy to lie. Neither did I. But wanting something doesn't make it true. I kissed the top of her head. Whatever happens, you never have to carry this by yourself again. She leaned against my shoulder. I'm glad I told you, so am I. Those 5 words gave me more strength than she could ever understand. 2 days later, Daniel called again. I finished tracing the refinance money. I drove straight to his office. He spread another set of documents across the conference table. The $400,000 didn't disappear. Where did it go? Into the business. I wasn't surprised. What kind of business expenses? He pointed towards several highlighted entries. Loan payments. Another page. Payroll. Another. Emergency capital. Then he looked directly at me. Claire, Ethan's company wasn't just struggling. He took a slow breath. It was weeks away from failing. I stared at the paperwork, but he kept telling me everything was fine. I'm sure he wanted you to believe that. I remembered family barbecues where Ethan confidently discussed expanding the company, the vacations he insisted we could afford, the new SUV, the expensive watch he'd bought himself the previous Christmas. The life I believed we were building, it had all been balanced on a cliff I never knew existed. Daniel slid one final document toward me. This one concerns me the most. It was a timeline. Mortgage refinance, insurance increase, business losses, investor demands, everything fit together in chronological order, like pieces of a puzzle or steps in a plan. I suddenly felt sick. Not because I finally believed Ethan had done something, because I was beginning to understand how someone might convince himself he had no other choice. That Friday afternoon, Captain Ruiz asked me to come to the fire department. He was no longer alone. A detective introduced herself as Karen Wallace, from the county sheriff's office. She spoke gently. "Mrs. Bennett, we're going to share some information that cannot leave this room." I nodded. Captain Ruiz turned a computer monitor toward me. "We obtained security footage from 3 homes on your street. The first video showed Ethan leaving our driveway that morning. Exactly as I remembered. He waved. He drove away. Normal. Then another camera appeared. A neighborhood entrance several blocks away. Timestamp, 9:24 a.m. The detective paused the video. Watch the lower right corner. A dark SUV entered the frame. It slowed, then turned onto a side street that eventually connected back toward our neighborhood. I recognized it instantly. Ethan's vehicle. He came back. Detective Wallace nodded. He never continued toward the interstate. I couldn't breathe. The next camera showed the SUV parked behind a small church less than half a mile from our house. The timestamp only minutes before the explosion. He told me he was halfway to the airport. He wasn't. I covered my mouth. There had to be an explanation. A forgotten laptop, a flat tire, anything. Detective Wallace quietly continued. We also obtained his cell phone location records through a warrant. Another map appeared. His phone matched the security footage exactly. He had returned. He had stayed nearby. Then he left only after emergency vehicles began arriving. Every instinct I had spent weeks trying to suppress suddenly came rushing to the surface. I heard myself whisper, "Oh, Ethan." The investigation moved quickly after that. Search warrants uncovered deleted messages from Ethan's business phone. Most had been erased. Several were recovered. One exchange caught everyone's attention. Unknown. Timing matters. Ethan, I know they'll be gone. Unknown, no mistakes. There were no direct references to our house, no mention of gas, no explicit confession. But taken together with everything else, the picture was becoming impossible to ignore. A week later, Detective Wallace invited me back. This time, she didn't bring files. She brought honesty. We believe we understand what happened. I sat perfectly still. Ethan never intended to be inside the house. I know. We also believe he expected you and Lily to be out before the explosion. I frowned. What? She leaned forward. The timer appears to have been set for later than the actual ignition. I don't understand. Our best theory is that he believed the house would be empty. The room spun, so my voice barely worked. He wasn't trying to kill us. She answered with heartbreaking precision. We don't believe that was his objective. For one impossible second, I actually felt relief. Then she finished the sentence. But he was willing to risk your lives. The relief disappeared instantly because she was right. Whether he wanted us dead or merely accepted the possibility, the difference no longer mattered. He had gambled. The stakes had been our daughter, our marriage, our lives. He had rolled the dice anyway. I walked out of the sheriff's office in silence. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before turning the key. When I finally reached Rachel's house, Lily ran outside to hug me. I held her longer than usual. That evening, after she fell asleep, I opened my laptop without crying, without shaking, without saying a single word to Ethan. I completed the online intake form for a divorce. Not because I hated him, because I finally understood the man I thought I had married no longer existed. Or perhaps he never had. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. The criminal case needed to finish. The evidence needed to speak, and when the time finally came, I wanted the truth, not my anger, to destroy the life he had built on lies. The knock came at 6:18 on a Tuesday morning. It was still dark outside. Rachel had just started the coffee maker, and I was packing Lily's lunch while she searched for her favorite purple hair tie upstairs. For one impossible second, I thought about pretending no one was home. Then I looked through the front window. 3 sheriff's deputies, 2 investigators, and a man in a navy windbreaker with large white letters across the back. FBI. Rachel looked at me. I didn't have to say anything. She already knew. I opened the door. Detective Karen Wallace gave me a small, respectful nod. Mrs. Bennett, we're executing an arrest warrant this morning. I swallowed. He's here. Ethan had spent the previous night in Rachel's guest room. After claiming he was exhausted from meetings with contractors and insurance representatives. Venti. He had become almost strangely affectionate over the past week, hugging Lily longer than usual, asking me whether I was sleeping, telling me everything would be all right. Looking back, I realized he wasn't comforting us. He was comforting himself. One deputy quietly asked, "Where is he?" Down the hall, first room on the left. The house remained silent for another 30 seconds. Then I heard footsteps, a door opening, someone saying, "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." Ethan's confused voice followed. "What is this?" Another voice. "You are under arrest." Rachel gently closed the front door before Lily could come downstairs. She looked at me. "I've got her." I nodded. Please, no child should ever watch her father being handcuffed, no matter what he had done. The local news spread the story before lunchtime. The headline no longer described an unfortunate gas explosion. Now it read, "Software executive charged in alleged insurance fraud scheme." Neighbors called. Friends texted, some cried, some apologized. A few admitted they had secretly wondered why Ethan seemed more worried about paperwork than about almost losing his family. One message stayed with me. It came from our next-door neighbor, Mr. Halpern. I kept thinking I was imagining things. The morning of the explosion, I thought I saw Ethan's SUV come back through the neighborhood. I told myself it couldn't have been him. Neither of us had wanted to believe what our eyes had seen, because believing it meant accepting that someone we knew, someone we trusted, could make a decision like that. Paul federal investigators soon joined the case. Insurance fraud involving interstate financial transactions had expanded the investigation beyond the county. Detective Wallace explained everything carefully. The financial evidence helped establish motive. Daniel's work had mattered. The refinance, the hidden debts, the increased insurance coverage, the failing company. Separately, None of it proved guilt. Together, it painted a picture that jurors could understand: a man drowning in debt, a desperate attempt to save everything at someone else's risk. Nah. Ethan's business collapsed almost immediately. Investors withdrew. Clients canceled contracts. Employees began searching for new jobs. The board removed him as chief executive within 48 hours of his arrest. I genuinely felt sorry for those employees. They had families, mortgages, children. They hadn't chosen any of this. Greed rarely destroys only the greedy. It leaves wreckage everywhere. The weeks that followed became a blur of interviews, legal meetings, and therapy appointments for Lily. She had started drawing again. Almost every picture included the same thing: a little girl holding her mother's hand. The child psychologist smiled gently when she showed me. "She's processing safety." I fought back tears. "I hope one day she won't have to. She won't forget," the therapist said. "But she can heal." Those words became my anchor. Healing didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. Healing meant refusing to let what happened define the rest of our lives. The prosecutor asked whether I would be willing to testify. "So long as Lily doesn't have to." "She's our priority too," he assured me. They already had enough evidence: financial records, forensic reports, security camera footage, cell phone location data, recovered messages, witness statements. My testimony would explain the marriage. Lily's testimony would explain the motive. No one wanted to put a 7-year-old through that if it could be avoided. I silently thanked every person working that case. Justice should never come at the cost of a child's peace. Months later, I saw Ethan for the first time since his arrest. Not at home, not in jail, in a conference room inside the county courthouse. Our attorneys had arranged a settlement discussion related to the divorce. He looked older, much older. His expensive suits were gone. His shoulders slumped. His confidence had disappeared. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me. "I never wanted either of you to get hurt," I believed him. Oddly enough, that didn't comfort me, because I had already learned the most dangerous people are not always the ones who want to hurt you. Sometimes they're the ones who convince themselves that everything will work out, that the risk is acceptable, that bad things only happen to other families. I looked directly into his eyes. "You keep saying that." His voice cracked. "Because it's true." I nodded slowly. "I know." He seemed surprised. Then I continued. "You didn't have to want us dead." The room fell silent. "You only had to decide our lives were worth risking." He closed his eyes. For the first time since all of this had begun, he had no answer, no explanation, no excuse, only silence. As I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt lighter. Not because Ethan had finally heard the truth, because I no longer needed him to understand it. Real revenge isn't watching someone suffer. It's reaching the point where their choices no longer control your future. That evening, Lily met me at Rachel's front door with a handmade card. Across the front, she had written in uneven second-grade handwriting, "Welcome home, Mom." Not "welcome back." Not "I'm sorry," just "welcome home." For the first time in months, I realized home wasn't a building. It wasn't the house we had lost. It wasn't even the marriage I had believed in. Home was the little girl waiting with open arms, and no one, not even the man I once trusted more than anyone, would ever be allowed to gamble with that again. The criminal case ended almost a year after the explosion. Not with a dramatic courtroom showdown, not with some shocking last-minute confession. It ended the way many real cases do, with a negotiated plea agreement. The prosecutor called me the afternoon before the hearing. "Ethan has agreed to plead guilty." I closed my eyes. What changed? He accepted responsibility for insurance fraud and the related criminal charges. More importantly, he agreed not to force Lily to testify. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I quietly asked, "Will she ever have to take the stand?" "No." I thanked him, not because I was happy. Because a little 7-year-old girl would never have to sit in a courtroom and relive the worst morning of her life while looking at her father across the room. If that alone felt like a victory. The sentencing hearing lasted less than an hour. I attended because I believed I owed it to myself, not because I wanted to watch Ethan suffer. The courtroom was almost full. Former employees, reporters, a few neighbors. His parents sat silently in the second row. His mother looked 20 years older than I remembered. My heart broke for her. She had lost a son without burying one. When the judge summarized the evidence, everything sounded strangely clinical. The refinance, the increased insurance coverage, the hidden debts, the altered gas connection, the security cameras, the recovered messages, facts, simple, unemotional facts. Yet each one represented a choice Ethan had made. The judge paused before imposing sentence. Mr. Bennett, greed often disguises itself as desperation. You convinced yourself that because you did not intend the worst possible outcome, you were free to risk innocent lives. The courtroom remained perfectly still. That is not how responsibility works. I glanced toward Ethan. His head never lifted. For the first time in many months, I didn't see my husband. I saw a man who had spent years making one compromise after another, until he could no longer recognize the line between solving a problem and creating a tragedy. When the hearing ended, I quietly walked away. I never looked back. The divorce became final 6 weeks later. There were no arguments left, no negotiations that mattered. His remaining assets were divided according to the law, and after debts and legal obligations were settled, I received a fair portion through the divorce settlement. It wasn't enough to replace the life we had lost. Nothing could, but it was enough to begin again. Rachel hugged me outside the courthouse. So she smiled. What now? I surprised myself with the answer. We build something smaller, not because I had to, because I wanted to. Hey. 3 months later, Lily and I moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in Westfield, just north of Carmel. It wasn't the biggest home on the block. There were no soaring ceilings, no oversized kitchen island, no custom staircase. The backyard was smaller. The driveway was shorter. The mortgage was comfortably within my budget, and for the first time in years, every dollar that paid for it was honest. The first night, Lily helped me unpack dishes while music played softly through a portable speaker. She carried one box at a time, proudly announcing where everything belonged. My room feels safe, she said. Those 4 words meant more to me than any luxury Ethan and I had ever owned. That weekend, we planted flowers beside the front porch. Neighbors walked over to introduce themselves. An elderly couple from across the street brought homemade banana bread. A retired firefighter offered to help install new smoke detectors. A young family invited Lily to ride bikes with their children. Life didn't magically become perfect. It simply became normal. And after everything we'd survived, normal felt extraordinary. My therapy remained part of our routine. Once every 2 weeks, Lily met with Dr. Hernandez. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. She stopped checking every lock twice before bed. She laughed more. She slept through the night. One afternoon, nearly 18 months after the explosion, she climbed into the passenger seat after school with an unusually serious expression. Mom, yeah. She looked down at her backpack. Can I ask you something? Always. She hesitated. Did I save you? The question caught every bit of air in my lungs. I pulled into a quiet parking lot beside a neighborhood park. Then I turned off the engine. I reached across the center console and took both of her little hands. You saved both of us. Her eyes filled with tears. I was so scared, I know. I thought Daddy would be mad forever. I gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. You did something incredibly brave. I didn't feel brave. I smiled through my own tears. That's because courage doesn't usually feel brave while you're doing it. She leaned across the console and I held her as tightly as I had. On the morning we escaped our house. Only this time, neither of us was shaking. As life settled into its new rhythm, I found myself wanting to help families who had experienced house fires and other disasters. The local fire department organized a community safety event every autumn. Captain Ruiz invited me to speak. Not about Ethan, but about preparedness. I almost declined, then I realized something. For months, that explosion had defined me. Perhaps it was time to redefine it. Standing beside Captain Ruiz and several firefighters, I spoke to young parents about smoke alarms, emergency plans, and something many people never discuss: listening to your children. They don't always have the right words, I told the crowd. Right. But sometimes they notice things adults overlook. Several parents nodded. One little boy squeezed his mother's hand. I smiled. Maybe our story could protect another family. Maybe pain didn't have to be wasted. Sometimes people still ask whether I hate Ethan. The honest answer surprises them. No, I don't hate him. Hatred would keep him living rent-free inside my heart. Instead, I learned something far more valuable. Trust should never be blind. Love should never require silence. And no amount of money is worth gambling with the people who believe in you. The greatest revenge wasn't watching Ethan lose his career, his reputation, or his freedom. The greatest revenge was building a peaceful life he could never take from us. A life where my daughter laughed without fear. A life where every lock on every door existed simply because it should, not because we were terrified. A life built on truth instead of deception. If you've stayed with me through this story, I hope you'll remember one thing. Greed rarely begins with one terrible decision. It begins with small compromises, tiny lies we tell ourselves until they become impossible to escape. And if you're ever fortunate enough to have someone who trusts you completely, protect that trust, because once it's broken, no amount of success, money, or regret can ever truly buy it back. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when your instincts or the words of someone you loved changed your life? Your story might encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.